Now, once we've accepted our duty, our distinct duty, to carry on the tradition, the evidential tradition of Christianity, the question then becomes, well, how do we get ready to do that? And as an officer, one of the things I learned early on is that I became good at what I did because we trained a lot. And that was important for us. So targeted training ends up being incredibly important for all of us as Christians, it turns out, to be the best case makers, the best representatives, the best ambassadors of Christ we can possibly be. Now, I'll tell you, I get asked this question a lot by youth pastors who are experiencing the same thing that I did for those early years, where people were walking away from the church, young people walking away from the church in their college years. And I have a solution. I'll offer it. It may sound controversial. Here it is. Stop teaching. Stop teaching. I was teaching that first year. I taught a full year just to watch my students walk away. And we've got great teachers in the church. But whatever we're doing, it doesn't seem to be very effective if we look at the statistics, right? So the question is, what do we need to do if we're not going to teach? We need to start training. There's a difference between teaching and training. Now, my experience as a youth pastor kind of informs my process and my thinking here. But what I've learned is this is the same approach I take with students, is the same approach I would take with myself. It's the same approach you can take with yourself. You may not be leading students. You may not even have any kids. Then the duty becomes, are you actually applying these principles to your life? So as I go through this, I will be referencing students, but remember, it's really about all of us and the duty we have to train ourselves to be able to make the case for what we believe. So what I've tried to do is develop a paradigm here that'll help you to think about it and remember it. And it's pretty simple. It's just a train model. Train, T-R-A-I-N. Because teaching is one form of instruction. I'll be honest with you, sometimes teaching just sounds like blah, blah, blah. Kind of like the old Snoopy cartoon or Charles Schulz cartoon where the teacher's talking in the background, you know, wah, 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 wah. That's how our students sometimes hear it. Training's very different. I can teach you how to wrestle by writing on the whiteboard. But until we get on the mat and actually wrestle, you're not learning how to wrestle. There's a difference between teaching and training. You've got to start by testing the people you're teaching and training. You have to test them. This is true for every officer. We get pulled into scenarios in our training years in that first 6 months on the job where our FTO, our field training officer, is going to test whether or not we can perform in a bad situation. Well, that helps us because it turns out once you've been tested and you know where you're weak, you're more motivated to study and get better at this so that in the end you can actually accomplish the goal to a certain level of excellence. So my question is, do our students even know how badly they're performing? Do they even know what little they actually know to make the case? I will typically role play with my students on the first session to show them how difficult it's going to be for them to defend what they believe with somebody who could be very aggressive as a non-believer. And so I'll role play as that non-believer. I kind of slip into my shoes to where I was until I was about 35, and I'll just recall my nature back then and how I would argue with my Christian friends. At the end of about an hour, my students are usually ready to give up. But it shows them that they're not ready yet. They're not ready to defend what they believe, but they could get ready. Now, do you even know yourself how ready you are to make the case for what you believe? In the book, we've got a short survey. It takes about 20 minutes or so. And if you complete it, it'll give you a good indication of where you stand. Are you ready to answer some of the more difficult objections we may face in the culture related to our Christian worldview? But begin training by testing yourself to know how good what your needs are, and those you might be leading or teaching to see where their deficiencies are. The next step in this, of course, is it's the R in the train model, is we've got to require more of our students than we ever have before. Look, as a parent, I require my kids to perform at a pretty high level in their school. I mean, if they're struggling in an area, I'll get them a tutor. If they're capable of taking an advanced placement class, I'm going to enroll them. If they're in an international baccalaureate program, we're going to push the bar as high as we can for our students in their academic studies. That's just normal. I think most of us as parents would do that. But then when it comes to their spiritual education, hey, whatever's happening in youth group, that's fine. Really? Do you even know what's happening in your youth group? Have we raised the bar there? The first year I was a youth pastor, I had a goal. The goal was to get kids to show up. We would throw parties basically every Sunday. It was Wednesday night pizza, games before we would start. I bet you if you're a youth pastor listening to me right now, you know that you've done that. I've done it. Now the question is, are we ready to raise the bar? Are we ready to academically challenge our students in the context of their youth groups, in the context of our church? Are we ready to do that for our own kids as parents? What I discovered was this: if I taught my high schoolers at the level of college, that's a high level, I would shoot for that level. And my high schoolers would actually kind of draw up and perform at that level. My own kids were junior high and elementary school age. I have 4. They would sit in the youth pastorate with me because they didn't want to go into the children's ministries where they should have been. They wanted to stay with mom and dad. So they would stay with us in our youth pastorate. Well, guess what happened years later? Years later, I discovered that all the stuff I was teaching the high schoolers at a college level was ricocheting off the high schoolers down to my kids, and they were catching all of it. I didn't even realize that my own kids in elementary school were capable of that much more. Raise the bar. Require more of the people you're leading. Require more of yourself. If you think you're willing to lean in on any number of topics that are of interest to you, is Christianity one of those topics? The A in the train model is to arm. We have to arm ourselves and arm our kids, arm whoever we're leading with the information they're going to need to have an impact on culture. And the first thing they're going to need to know is, what is the culture saying about Christianity? What are the objections we need to be able to respond to? That's going to take some time for us to understand. We would typically assign reading to our students in the forms of the books that are written by the most popular atheists who are selling the most volumes, right? For example, this one, God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, was an important read for our students to see what's the other side basically saying about Christianity. And it's usually pretty hostile. I want my students to know what the hostile objections are before we even begin. Now, of course, we're not going to leave it there. I don't want my students as a youth pastor or my own kids as a parent to encounter the objections of the culture for the first time when they're away from me in university. I want them to encounter those objections while we're still together so I can offer them the truth. And there's lots out there you can offer them in terms of apologetics books and, of course, Scripture. We have to have clarity and familiarity with Scripture. And a lot of our students don't have it by the time they go to college, so they're fooled by people who will excerpt Scripture and twist it. So it's important for us. It's just about really inoculation theory. In other words, we could easily isolate our kids, isolate our students, protect them while they're at home. That's great, but when they finally go to college, they will be away from our protection. They're unprepared, and they've got no shield to protect them. Or we could inoculate them while they're home. In other words, when you inoculate someone for the flu, you give them a small dose of the flu, so when they see this in the larger context, they're already ready to fight off the flu. We want to expose our students to the bad teaching, to the bad ideas, while they're with us, so they're inoculated, so that when they're not with us, they've already heard this stuff. They won't be hearing it for the first time in the classroom, and when they do hear it, they'll be able to say, you know what, been there, done that, already heard that objection, already know what the truth is on that issue. T-R-A, the I. The I is the thing that transforms teaching into training. And what it is simply this: we have to involve our students in the challenge, on the battlefield of ideas. We have to get our kids in the game. We have to get in the game. And what I mean by that is, you think you could change your entire approach with your students or your entire approach with yourself by simply reading more. That'll help. But you will change your life and the life of your students, not with more books. You'll change that with a calendar. What are you willing to calendar that will cause your students to have to put this into play? I knew I wanted my students to have the advantage of understanding how to maneuver in conversations and to make the case for the truth. So I decided to get them involved in the battlefield of ideas. I wanted to teach them how to be better theologically. And I knew if I made an event, I posted an event 8 weeks out, it would give me 8 weeks to train for that event, and those students would be paying attention because they know the battle is coming. Think of it this way. Boxers get heavy sometimes in between fights. Then they sign a contract for the fight, and they get in the best shape of their life. By the eve of the fight, they're in the best shape of their life. What caused them to get in that kind of shape? It was the calendared fight that caused them to get in that kind of shape to begin with. We need to simply calendar an event for ourselves and for our students that'll cause us to take this seriously. I wanted to teach my students theology. I wanted to be better theologians. So I started taking my students once a year for a week to Salt Lake City to evangelize Mormons with the gospel. because it caused them to have to master what they believed about the triune nature of God, the nature of salvation, the nature of all kinds of things that are different than what Mormons believe about this. In other words, they had to become good Orthodox Christian theologians in order to evangelize the Mormons they were going to meet. And then I wanted to learn about the objections of atheism. So I took them for a week every year in our state to UC Berkeley. That was a very hostile environment, a great place to encounter atheistic student groups or professors or local atheists. And that interaction caused them to study for 8 weeks before we got there. They took this seriously because we calendared an event that challenged them to put the teaching into practice. And the last thing you have to have in that train model is the end. People are going to get hurt in any battle, in any contest. And sometimes a victory can be just as bruising as a defeat. And our students may go to these events and come out just unbelievably inspired and equipped and prepared now as a result, but there's a good chance along the way that there'll be a rough day, a rough night, a rough encounter with somebody on the street who maybe doesn't believe, is better equipped to deal with the challenges, better equipped to deal with a Christian than our Christian student was to deal with him or her. What do we do when that happens? We have to be in a position where we can nurture, that's the end, nurture those who are on the battlefield with us. In other words, we have to be so good at what we do that we can actually pick up the pieces when things start to crumble. So we can't go on these trips if we're not equipped. Every boxer has a cut man in the corner. When the boxer comes back and he's got a cut, that cut man's job is to close the cut so he can get back in the ring. And that's what we have to do, sadly, sometimes with students who get bruised in their encounters. I can remember one year, for example, I had a student who was so shaken by what an atheist said to her that she felt like her faith was actually shaken. Well, we had to spend some time with her to help her see where the errors were in the thinking of the atheist to help her be able to reconcile this. We have to be ready to nurture those that we lead. And remember, when we do something repeatedly, it becomes like muscle memory. The more I share what I believe, the better I'm able to deal with the objections, and the better I'm able to articulate what I believe. You're not going to be good the first time. You do it over and over and over again. We take our students in these events because the repeated exposure makes them good at what they do. And the more you practice, the more you train, the better chance you're going to have of surviving. Training is an essential part of a forensic faith.